and welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we have a very special guest, Sanjay Wagle, who I've actually known for years and years because we're both in the clean tech investment world. But as we're about to find out, Sanjay is sort of venturing out to a new aspect of that I find very fascinating. And before we get started, I just want to tell everyone about some upcoming guests. First of all, like and subscribe to the channel. We never push that enough like other channels do, but it is important because we're trying to get climate information out to the world. And the more you like and subscribe and hit the notification bell and comment in the comments, that helps the algorithm spread the message to more people. And so in upcoming, and this is a special day and time, this coming Thursday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, we're having Matthew England on. We've had Matthew on before in the early days of Climate Chat when it was on Clubhouse. And he's an expert on many subjects we're interested in, including AMOC, the impacts of AMOC collapse. But his most recent paper is trying to explain the accelerated warming we've seen very, very recently. And he attributes that to sort of ocean stratification, which may be in conflict or maybe complementary to Jim Hansen's work, saying that it's due, and Leon Simons, our co-host, work, how it's due to ship emissions and things like that. So that'll be really fascinating. We're going to cover a lot of interesting subjects this Thursday, 3 p.m. Then Sunday at our regular time, next Sunday, we're going to have Ben Santer on. Ben is a very well-known climate scientist, semi-retired, and his work focuses on how we know that climate change is caused by humans. So it'll be a very interesting discussion there. And then again on a special day, Thursday, but at the regular time, 10 a.m. Pacific, the following Thursday, we're having Stephen Chu, former Energy Secretary. And actually, Sanjay, you worked for him, right?
My old boss.
And Energy Secretary, former Nobel Prize winner. And we're going to be talking about climate change and politics and things like that. So that's a good segue, Sanjay. Why don't you start off? And first of all, welcome to Climate Chat. And why don't you give us a bit of your background?
Thanks, Dan. And great to talk with you. I know on this channel, you generally talk with scientists. And so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you, in particular about the area I'm focused on, climate adaptation. But yeah, as you know, my background is not as a scientist. I'm an investor. And we got to know each other during that first wave of clean tech investing in the 2000s. I was at a firm back then called VantagePoint Capital. And we ended up being one of the big investors in that space in the 2000s, and invested in 25 different clean tech companies. The best known of those by far was Tesla Motors, where we were in the first institutional round in about 2006, and got to drive the first Tesla Roadster that they made off the hand-built line in the parking lot in San Bruno, and kind of off to the races from there. I think we also invested in another company together, Dan, Solazyme.
That's right.
Which of course used algae to convert sugars from corn, cane, and biomass to high-value products. So not just fuels, but sustainable chemicals, materials, nutraceuticals. They had a line of cosmetics at Sephora stores worldwide.
Still available. Algenist.
That's right, Algenist.
Still available around the world.
I think that sells at about 1,000 times the price per weight of fuels. So I
think you're paying for the package and the advertising, like all cosmetics. I think
anything to stop wrinkles, Dan.
Right.
But yeah, and so I went from there. As you mentioned, I worked in the U.S. Department of Energy under Secretary Stephen Chu during the Obama first term, as part of the team they brought in to help oversee the $80 billion of clean energy stimulus programs. It was kind of an exciting time. We got to invest in at a time when all the activity in the private sector had pretty much shut down for the energy transition. A lot of that was happening through these tax, loan guarantee, and grant programs. But probably my favorite project at that time was helping to launch ARPA-E. So a collection of great scientists led by the first director, Arun Majumdar, now here at Stanford. And I served as the associate director for commercialization. So taking the successful technologies and helping them move into the marketplace. Really exciting time. But fast forwarding, my role now is as a co-founder and managing director of Lightsmith Group. And we invest in growth stage technology companies focused on this theme of climate resilience or climate adaptation. And we've been investing for the last 5 years in climate adaptation companies. And so wanted to have the opportunity to talk with you about ways we could think about leveraging technology to adapt to the effects of climate change, to build in resilience to some of these climate shocks, and also achieve more decarbonization along the way.
Right. And so to set the stage, you and I, we had coffee a little while ago, and there's lots we can talk about in terms of clean tech investing, which typically is, clean energy and things that lower carbon emissions. And that's like the main focus of, quote, clean tech, or what's sometimes called climate tech investing. But you're taking a different tack now, and you're focusing on companies that help with climate adaptation and climate resilience. And I think that's really interesting. And of course, it's interesting that we've gotten to that point. And the rest of Climate Chat, we talk about how we're there already, and how we're going to need much more of that in the future. But maybe just to start off, why don't you define for us what you consider climate adaptation and climate resilience?
Sure. Yeah, so we started looking into this about 6-7 years ago, and in the late teens. Yes, the energy transition was really underway by then, and a lot of money, billions of dollars, was coming into climate mitigation, mostly renewables, electric vehicles, batteries, a little bit at the time in sustainable ag. And we started looking at the other half of the climate equation. What is happening due to these disruptions from climate change? And we started to have a few realizations that weren't really surprising realizations, but at least among investors, other people weren't thinking about these questions at the time. And first, we saw climate disruptions were already unfolding around us. And I think the received view back then was, climate change is happening, it's important, but it's not going to affect me and my industry. It's sea level rise in 2100. Right. So, Greenland, Antarctica, but it's nothing I have to worry about right now. And yes, it'll be bad for my kids, but at least among investors, they didn't see it as a relevant question. We started to see, wait a second, climate disruptions are having, in addition to humanitarian tragedy, having real effects on the real economy. And, you're familiar with the NOAA chart of billion-dollar disasters in the US. And we saw increasing numbers of billion-dollar disasters and having real consequences. So back then, it looked like 100 to 150 billion dollars a year of damages from a dozen or a couple dozen billion-dollar events, and that's escalated to almost double that. 150 to 300 billion dollars between 2020 and 2024. That's about between 0.5% and 1% of U.S. GDP. I mean, this is like a recession happening every year. Because of weather events. And this is all kinds of events: flood, hail, drought, heat, wildfire, tropical cyclone, winter storms, and freezes like the freeze in Texas. So real consequences are happening in the economy, in every sector of the economy. So that was the first realization. Mm-hmm. The second realization was we saw that businesses, governments, and communities as well were starting to make tens of billions of dollars of spending in response. They were just being forced to respond. The only thing was they weren't calling that spending and that response climate adaptation. Right. And the companies providing the services and technologies and products, they weren't calling it climate adaptation. They were calling it risk management or wildfire response or other things, flood defense. But the spending was being driven by these climate enhanced disasters. And third, we started to see there were investable opportunities. There were companies with technology-based solutions to adapt in smarter ways, more effectively, at lower costs, to build in intelligence, data, analytics, AI, to manage these risks in smarter ways. that would have an outsized growth opportunity as demand for those solutions grew. And in fact, we started to think that climate adaptation, the other half of the climate equation, would be as big a transition, adapting our economy, our society, every sector, every region to these shocks from climate change will be as big a transition, if not bigger, than the energy transition.
Well, that's partly because we're failing at the energy transition. That's part of the reason why. What is it? Someone said, I don't know who it was actually, who said that you have a choice of three things: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And you can take your pick of how
we're
much
having a mix of all three of those. But,
right.
but I guess I would say that was one of the perceptions that immediately comes up, is that, and a reaction we got early on when we started this was climate adaptation is giving up on climate mitigation.
Right. So maybe a moral hazard. Did you get that too?
Yes, profiting off people's misery
Okay.
was a reaction we got. And I think
I'm sure we'll get some of that in the comments here, but go ahead.
Our view is that we need to adapt in smart ways at lower cost, more effectively, and we need to scale up the technologies that can help us do that. Because we're starting to adapt now. We're just doing it in the worst possible ways with the least effectiveness and the highest cost. We can be a lot smarter. We can build in resilience to our systems and economic sectors and communities. We just haven't done that yet. And I think people are now aware of the climate disruptions. There's a lot of awareness about the risks of floods and droughts and wildfires and heat events. There's much less awareness still about the solutions. What can we do about it that are cost-effective and even profitable solutions?
Well, actually, so just to help get everybody to understand this better, why don't we get into now some specific companies that you've invested in that fit this climate adaptation and resilience framework?
Sure. So one of the areas we focused on is how wildfire and storm risks increased by climate change are disrupting electric utilities. And what are technology-based solutions to that? Sensors on the grid, grid management software. And in our case, we invested in a Bay Area company called AI Dash that uses satellite imaging and analytics and AI to help utilities manage these wildfire and storm risks. And typically, well, first, what's happening and what's been happening is our utility up here, PG&E, 10th largest utility in the US, went bankrupt back in 2018 because of the Camp Fire, destroyed the town of Paradise, California, due to an equipment failure. And, sparking from lines and equipment always used to start fires. But because of climate change, it's hotter, it's drier, the winds are stronger, and they're now blowing up multiple times a year into major firestorms. That didn't used to happen all the time and is now a major existential risk for electric utilities. And so the traditional ways they manage that, vegetation management, 80% of power outages are caused by storms and contact with vegetation. They will cover their territory over 3, 5, 7 years and do what's called cycle trim. They'll just go and inspect different parts of their territory. The risks are too great to do it that way. And they need to start using technology to target to the highest risk spots. And that's part of what...
Just so I understand. So you're saying rather than just on a schedule, it happens outside my house all the time. They're coming by to trim the trees away from the power lines. You're saying instead of doing it on a schedule, use satellite information or whatever to target, hey, do this one right now. Put it ahead of everything else.
Exactly. Okay. And so that's one of the ways you can leverage technology to be a lot smarter within current budgets, because what's happening is the utilities, the California utilities, for example, have gone from spending a few $100 million a year on wildfire risk management to now $10–15 billion a year. Part of that is on very expensive approaches like undergrounding power lines, which absolutely almost eliminates wildfire risk, but at the highest possible cost. The other thing they tend to do is what's called public safety power shutoffs. They'll just shut down the grid at the highest risk times. Very costly to businesses and homeowners and consumers. there are smarter ways to approach this using technology, and this is one of the ways.
Okay.
And
Right.
so hopefully, if they use smart technologies like satellite imaging and analytics, they can reduce the risk much more within current budgets and without jacking up our electric rates.
There's a company called, do you look at a company, I think it's called Fire, that uses autonomous helicopters to go out and fight the fires.
I haven't seen that one. There's so many companies using drones, using satellites, using robots, using all kinds of software, sensors on the grid. There's lots of great approaches. And what I'd say is, having invested in the energy sector over the last 25 years, electric utilities are not great at adopting innovation and new technologies. They're tough customers of new technologies and tough customers of startups, but they will adopt new technology when they absolutely have to, when there's no other way, when they're forced by regulators. And that's part of what's happening here with wildfire and storm risks to the extent they've increased.
So anything on any companies you've invested in on the storm risk side of things as opposed to the fire side?
Yeah, I mean, this AI Dash also addresses storm risk for utilities in the Southeast, Midwest, Northeast. As I mentioned, 80% of power outages are caused by storms, and that is amping up as well. And so, can you maintain your equipment? Can you trim the vegetation and trees? Can you inspect the places that need to be inspected to avoid that? And then, can you respond faster to exactly where the problems are when storms do cause damage and outages? Those are things you can do with technology.
Okay. And how about besides fire and storm? What are some other areas of climate adaptation and resilience?
Well, I'll tell you an example in the agriculture sector.
Okay.
So I think it's a truism to say that agriculture and farming is highly dependent on the weather. But other than ingesting weather forecasts, farmers don't actually have good tools to respond to what's happening, which is much greater volatility of weather and climate conditions, much greater frequency of severe extreme heat and heat stress or drought, severe storms and precipitation, flooding, wind damage, and changing incidence of pests and disease. They're buffeted by all of these that are causing either yield losses or even crop failures. And they just don't have tools to respond. And one of the companies we invested in is a Brazil precision agriculture company called CleanTech. And what it does is it puts sensors throughout the farm on all farm equipment, devices in the hands of farm managers, and creates a software platform that ingests all that information, takes IBM weather forecasts and data from in-field mini weather stations, and does a very practical solution. It optimizes day-ahead operating schedules. What should farmers do in each field, each hour of the day? What equipment do you need? What labor? What chemicals? And then in real time gives visibility to what's happening. So when there's a problem, machine breaks down, labor doesn't show up, they loaded the wrong chemical, or the weather changes, they can adjust their operating plan in real time to get more done at lower cost. And there's some real practical benefits to this, real financial savings, less chemicals, less fuel, less labor and equipment cost, but also higher yields and getting more done in these tight operating windows. So it's a really practical solution that delivers ROI. And that's, I think, why it's grown since we invested from about 20 million in ARR to about 70 million now. And we're working on a sale process to some big ag companies. Wow. So one of the things I wanted to say with that example is two things. A lot of adaptation can happen in ways that are not pure play adaptation, meaning what this technology does is not just adaptation. Right. It does a whole bunch of things for the customers. Adaptation is one increasingly important component of it, dealing with changing weather conditions in a smarter way. And the other thing is it delivers real ROI, because in the end, adaptation solutions aren't going to get adopted, aren't going to scale up unless customers are buying them. And they have to deliver real benefits. And in agriculture, it's clear farmers will use new technologies, but only if it solves critical operating problems and delivers real immediate savings. So they're not scared of new technologies. It's just a lot of technologies aren't delivering that immediate benefit.
Right. And I can imagine that it might be hard, even if you had a company that might protect you against wildfire, but it's just like for future risk management that
Yes.
people will be very optimistic. That's not going to happen to me. But if you have something that maybe helps that, but also gives you something today that you can use every day.
And that's how I see adaptation happening. It's not some future risk protection thing, but primarily it's integrating adaptation tools into the ways that different industries are managed today and in ways that deliver immediate financial benefit to customers that are practically useful today.
So how about, I understand you have some investments in supply chain management, is that right?
Yeah. So supply chains are another area. Supply chains,
Huge
logistics, getting disrupted by climate change. Some examples are, I think, freight waves. Estimated that in 2024, weather events caused $100 billion of supply chain losses. Also learned that 23% of road delays are caused by weather events, costing $2 to $3 billion a year of impacts. Another example that's been in the news recently, the Panama Canal drought is reducing daily transit from about 40 a day to about 20 a day. And that's increasing the cost per container by about $300 to $500. And there's similarly been droughts affecting shipping of coal and steel on the Rhine. So storms, droughts, all kinds of climate events, Hurricane Ida disrupting pharmaceutical manufacturing and supply chains in the Caribbean. All kinds of events are happening, disrupting supply chains and logistics. We looked at a range of supply chain management software companies. And of course, that software does a lot of things for managing supply chains. But one of the things it does is manage the risk of weather events and disruptions in the supply chain. The investment we made was actually in supply chain insurance. It's a company called Parcel. So insurance, obviously, very relevant to climate risk. We've looked at a lot of insurance-related companies. And so this investment combines insurance and supply chain. And what it does is marine cargo insurance.
Okay. So
Parcel uses better data and AI to understand what drives damage and delay for marine cargo shipments, especially high-value, temperature and time-sensitive cargo, including pharmaceuticals, food and beverages, and computer chips and electronics. And so, a kind of secret goal of our climate adaptation investment fund is to find ways to save cocoa, coffee, wine, and beer from climate change. And so it turns out Parcel is one of the biggest insurers of Chilean wine shipments.
Wow. I would tell people that, companies used to optimize their operations, but that's actually not what you want. You want to be robust operations so that you can withstand, when you're optimized, it's you get the highest capability or throughput for a certain set of conditions, but climate change is changing all those conditions. And so you end up breaking those supply chains.
For resilient supply chains, you often want redundancy or buffer storage. You want a lot of networked, multiple optionality. And so efficiency often is and just in time is the opposite of that. Right. So I think we've all learned that. But part of it is you want better data and intelligence. And that's what Parcel is bringing, so they can offer premiums that more accurately reflect risk, but also taking those insights to provide the shippers advice on where and how it's better to ship by sea, how to package products, how to store in warehouses on land to minimize the risk. So it's both optimization, or at least risk optimization.
And also, I understand you're invested in areas of human health that have to do with climate.
That wasn't one of our focus areas originally, but we started to see that climate change is having real effects on human health, and started to look at medical diagnostics companies that could help respond to it. We ended up investing in Brazil, and in a digitally enabled health services company that offers medical diagnostics and vaccinations. And by the way, we focus on growth stage companies, partially because we think that largely we can adapt using existing technologies, and those are faster to scale up and can deliver real returns. I think we're not focused on VC. There's opportunities for disruptive new technology, but mainly we focused on how do you apply existing technology companies and help them scale up in ways that address these climate disruptions. And so what's happening in Brazil is because of climate change, we're seeing across Latin America and the Caribbean booming mosquito populations. And that's in part because of warmer winters, in part because of more standing water from floods and storms. But all kinds of mosquito-borne illnesses are on the rise. Zika, West Nile virus, malaria, and in this case, dengue fever. So last year, there were 12 million cases of dengue fever across Latin America and the Caribbean, 10 million of those in Brazil. Half the world's cases of dengue fever last year were in Brazil, and compared to a few 100,000 cases normally. And so it's a real crisis, and less than 10% of Brazilians are vaccinated for dengue fever. And so what this company does is all kinds of lab exams and vaccinations, including for dengue fever. And so they're a frontline response. There's now a surge in spending from private insurers and the government to address this crisis. And this is exactly the kind of frontline solution that you need to have to adapt to this effect, in this case on human health.
So kind of makes me think, take it back 5 years ago and you're looking to the future of where you think things are going to evolve. Are things evolving much faster than even you thought 5 years ago in terms of climate impacts, or ramping up faster than, I mean, you thought they would ramp up, that's why you invested, but
yeah.
What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had always said, the impacts from climate change are already happening. They're going to be ramping up. I think we were thinking in kind of a 2030 timeframe. Here we are in 2025. And I think the vision we had for 2030, at least in terms of climate disruptions unfolding, what we haven't seen yet is a flow of capital investment and scaling up of the solutions, or even we're just at the beginnings of awareness, I think, of connecting those disruptions to solutions. I hope that will start to happen faster. You and I, we were investors in that first wave of clean tech, and we've now seen at least the energy transition go from the first $1 billion globally, small beginnings back in the 2000 period, to 25 years later, crossing the first $1 trillion invested in a year. And we're going to need to see that kind of transition for climate adaptation, hopefully a lot faster than the next 25 years.
Yeah. And I think you kind of answered it, but you've called this the climate adaptation and resilience an unavoidable opportunity. Can you tell us why you call it that?
Yeah. So, my partner in Lightsmith Group, Jay Coe, coined the phrase the unavoidable opportunity, released a report on it that you can find online. And it started by looking at the IPCC's AR6 synthesis report, the summary for policymakers. And if you look in there, one thing that was striking that he saw was there's almost no difference in IPCC's modeled warming by 2030 in the high versus low emission scenarios. When you look at the NDCs and what realistically can be done by 2030, there's almost no difference in the high versus low scenarios. There's an expected warming that we're going to see, says IPCC.
Sure.
And then when you look out to 2040, there's still very little difference. So there's a certain amount of warming we should expect. And I think you and I know that there's much more likely to be surprises on the bad side of that, with more warming rather than less, given the tipping points we're looking at, and given the state of climate action towards the NDCs. So what that means is it's unavoidable. We are going to see warming. But even if we didn't see warming, at 1.5 C today, look at what the disruptions look like. We have to adapt to that. And so the opportunity to invest in climate adaptation is real. it's large, it's unavoidable. That's basically the idea. You know, there's so much uncertainty in the world right now. You almost can't predict anything about tomorrow. We don't know what trade policy is going to be, interest rates, tax, fiscal, monetary policy. You know, Jay likes to say we don't know who Taylor Swift will be dating next year. We don't know very much about the future right now. But one thing we can say with a high degree of certainty is that unfortunately, disruptions from climate change will keep occurring as we've been seeing, if not getting stronger. So the unavoidable opportunity is investing in the tools we'll need to adapt in smart ways.
Actually, so there's a very basic reason why the difference between the high and low scenarios on IPCC don't vary much in the short run. And that's because we've emitted 2.6 trillion tons of CO2 already. And the difference between current levels and zero is about 1.5% a year of increase on that 2.6 trillion tons. So even if you cut it back a little bit, you're talking about something percent difference in emissions. Because the one thing that people need to understand about climate change that many people don't understand is that CO2 is unlike other forms of pollution we're used to, where when you finally clean the damn thing up, it's okay again. But with CO2, it just lasts forever in the atmosphere.
So the effect is
2.6 trillion tons, which translates to now about 1 trillion plus tons in the atmosphere, with 50% increase over pre-industrial. That's going to be there for a long time. Yeah. So that's why there's a little difference. So how is the market, you know, how have you guys done so far on your some of the things you mentioned sound like they're doing pretty well. Yeah. Is it a better place to invest than traditional clean tech and climate tech?
I don't know about better, but you know, we see a huge opportunity and a huge need that isn't being met in a lot of places. We see a lot of companies out there with solutions in every sector. One thing we did is when we started this, we mapped out where are the climate disruptions playing out in different sectors, and where are there solutions that fit that? And we mapped out about 24 different solution areas. And back in 2018, we saw $180 billion of annual spend in those solution areas. We redid that analysis last year, and those 24 same solution areas had $480 billion in spending. So that's a 20+% CAGR of spending growth, much faster than had been forecast, which was more like 10 to 11% per year. And we think that extra growth is in part the signal of the response to climate change. That is adaptation starting to happen. And so we think there's huge opportunity. This is what we focused on, and we certainly hope a lot more people will be doing this because, as I said, we're starting to adapt already. We're just not doing it in the smartest possible ways.
Right. And people see investing in clean technology as an optional thing that we can do or not to do. Adaptation is something you got to do. I mean, either that's that or rebuilding over and over and over again. I mean, that's.
Yeah. And I would like to say that, you know, climate adaptation, again, is not an either or trade-off with decarbonization.
Oh, yeah.
They can and should happen together. Our renewables and batteries and electric vehicle infrastructure, the kinds of things we're doing for decarbonization will have to be resilient and adapted. And the adaptation solutions we invest in will have to be low carbon. We have to do both at the same time. And most of the things we invest in have measurable GHG reductions, as well as providing adaptation, like the precision agriculture company CleanTech, which reduces GHG emissions on 35 million acres. It's a very resource-intensive industry, farming, and uses a lot of chemicals and a lot of fuel. And so by being resilient and efficient, you can adapt and decarbonize at the same time.
And so the one thing about adaptation is that after a while, it's not going to be any good. I mean, if you don't do the mitigation and we get into 3-4 C of warming,
all bets are off.
You can try to adapt all you want. You're not going to have a societal infrastructure around you or financial infrastructure around you to do that. Any thoughts on that, by the way?
Well, maybe this is, we can talk about another topic we'd wanted to talk about, which is
the
Woodwell Climate Research Center.
That's right.
I think we talked about, I'm on the board of the Woodwell Climate Research Center. I used to like to say that Woodwell Climate is the most important climate research organization outside the US government. But now with the federal science enterprise being dismantled, especially for climate change, I may have to drop that modifier at the end.
Yeah.
But Woodwell Climate was founded by a man named George Woodwell, who's one of the early climate scientists. He helped to create the IPCC and testified at the first US congressional hearing on climate change in 1986. So, we owe a real debt to that first generation of scientists that brought our knowledge to where it is today. But Woodwell Climate focuses on science and research for climate solutions, driving solutions that can help decarbonize through protecting and restoring ecosystems. So think of them as the science of terrestrial systems, how forests, grasslands, farmlands, wetlands, and peatlands, how they interact in the carbon cycle and with climate change, but then also how climate affects them. They also look at safeguarding people and places. So they model climate change and how climate risk is playing out in communities and how we can adapt. And that's part of what attracted me to working with them. So I'll tell you more about what they do, but we were talking about the topic of geoengineering. You talk about this on your shows sometimes. And they are focused on natural climate solutions, preserving forests and ecosystems. But they issued a statement saying that given the pace at which we are or are not scaling up climate mitigation and climate adaptation, we need more science on geoengineering. And in particular, they were looking at solar radiation modification approaches.
We could talk a lot about on this show. Yeah.
And so they're realizing that this also is not a trade-off. We have to do both. We have to protect natural systems and restore them to sequester carbon and avoid forests turning from sinks to sources of carbon, which is happening now. But also, we need more science on the effects of SRM. And in particular, what they're saying is this activity is likely going to happen, but it needs to be done with proper guidelines, governance, transparency, and consultation with affected communities. So a lot of the SRM approaches are looking at stratospheric atmosphere injection above the Arctic. We're going to need to consult with Arctic communities that are going to be the most affected by this. And so that's part of their point, which is, hey, we're focused on terrestrial ecosystems and climate solutions for those. But we see, as scientists, we need more science on SRM, on geoengineering, but it has to be done with proper governance, transparency, and consultation with affected people.
Yeah, and we've done a number of programs on that as well, on the governance issue, but all of those issues. Yeah, it's a big one. So so Woodwell is located. Didn't it used to be called Woods Hole Climate Research because it's located in Woods Hole, Massachusetts?
Beautiful Woods Hole, and of course there's a bunch of scientific organizations around there, including Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Marine Biological Labs, and so they decided to name the institute, the research center, after George Woodwell.
Also, I guess it reduced the confusion too, I guess, against the other ones. And how, so this is an independent, it's not part of a university, right? Is that right? Is it?
Yeah, it's an independent research institution. It's kind of unusual. As I said, outside the US government, there isn't such a large collection of great climate scientists. Used to be run by John Holdren, the chief science advisor for President Obama, and after that by Phil Duffy, science advisor for President Biden, and now is run by Max Holmes. So a collection of great scientists.
And how is it generally funded? It's philanthropic, I assume, right?
Philanthropic and individual donations, and there are some large organizations funding climate solutions, including natural climate solutions. Obviously the tech companies are focused a lot on climate change, and there's a collection of tech companies looking at carbon removal technologies and committing to purchasing those. And so there's a lot of ways that I hope Woodwell Climate can partner with large companies that care about climate change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is fascinating. We're going to have to get Max on the program to
I'd recommend it.
Do a
I've learned so much from them. A lot of it's scary. So one of their big projects is on permafrost thaw. It's called Permafrost Pathways. It was funded by a large grant. And they're doing some of the best science to understand the dynamics of permafrost thaw. And as you know, scientists at the leading edge have a lot of insights about climate change that aren't generally in the news or are included in the IPCC's modeling. And one of the things I learned is that permafrost thaw might account for somewhere between 10 to 40%, might use up 10 to 40% of our carbon budget for stabilizing at 2C. So big error bars, obviously, but that is an alarming statistic. Yeah,
I don't think there really is any budget left for 2C. I mean, it depends what you mean by budget, but that's a whole other discussion whether the concept of budget's a good one, because it seems to people think, oh, good, we still have some time left. No, actually, you got to get to zero like right now if you want to prevent 2C.
Right. Obviously, just a way of quantifying in rough terms the order of magnitude of the impact of permafrost thaw.
But it's not actually staying below. It has a percentage chance of staying below, and that percentage is usually 50%, 2/3. Something you would never accept for your children getting on an airplane. Oh, don't worry, there's a 2/3 chance it's going to arrive safely at the destination.
Yeah, obviously we don't do well thinking probabilistically and stochastically
about future things. But anyway, so that was really fascinating to hear about both of those things about the climate adaptation resilience. We're going to invite Leon Simons, our co-host, on to ask his question. And while he's doing that, I'm going to be looking at the YouTube live comments here and picking up other questions from that. So let's bring Leon. And Leon, welcome. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. There you go.
Hi, Sanjay. Thank you for coming on the show. I was wondering, do you also use climate models yourself to look at what to invest in? And because of course we've seen now that it's climate change is, and especially global warming, is accelerating, and in certain regions even more, and even European models they don't take into account the crucial impacts of aerosols, where they underestimate regional warming in the summer of 1 degree. And we see now the Panama Canal has to invest, I think, about 8.5 billion for water and climate resilience. So I think so you use climate models and
no. And here's why. I'm not that sophisticated person. I try to understand the science, I try to understand the models, but I'm just an investor, and I'm just looking where the dollars are flowing and where the customer demand is and where there are solutions today that we can apply to that. Adaptation starts with a very simple proposition. What's happening today, right now? And where are there dollars to spend on solutions? Now, our companies use very sophisticated technologies, including all kinds of models, analytics, AI, big data. Some of them may use downscaled climate models, but that's not the basis of most solutions. Now, weather forecasts and real-time weather data incorporated is often very useful. I would also say that we do look at equity and access to these technologies. So, I'm looking for where the dollars are, where things are investable. But ultimately, we also invest in some companies serving or based in developing countries, in particular India and Brazil, where we see that these countries are now sources of some very interesting technology companies and innovation. They're also very large markets in and of themselves, and are also being disrupted by climate change. So we're looking beyond the US.
Okay, that's interesting. But I'm just a bit worried that you look at adaptation from the current perspective, then you, of course, now you see what's happened to the Panama Canal, where you're right, there's much less shipping happening there, especially last year when there was so little water available. And then if you prepare for the future, if you invest billions for a climate that will be very different once those investments have been realized, then you invest a lot of money in the wrong infrastructure. So I think that's important to take into consideration, and it's not just these enormous companies that are doing it, but also for countries, of course, where
that's a great
our height will not be the right height, or the water systems will not be suitable, or the heat plants will not be in place for these extreme weather events.
The infrastructure that is being built today that will last 30 plus years, whether it's in energy or water or transport, ports, airports, absolutely does need to consider climate change and the physical impacts that they'll experience and be built to those standards and factor in those risks. Some of the companies we look at, whether in software or in insurance, that is one of the use cases for some of the things that we invest in.
Thanks.
Okay. And by the way, I should mention that Stacy is on vacation now, for all of you who are hoping that she would be on to ask her questions and do the YouTube comments. Through the YouTube comments, I would say a lot of them are all about, well, I'll give you just an example here. You'll see what it's like. Chad asks, how is improved transport not facilitating consumerism and further ecological decline? In other words, if you're making things more resilient, then we can keep operating longer, which will, just get climate change to get worse and worse. Any general thoughts on that? There's a whole bunch of questions that are sort of on this same, not exactly doomerism mindset, but close to that.
I mean, I guess the main impacts that I would see from investments in climate adaptation solutions would be ultimately what you should see is less damage, less loss, less harm caused to people, to economic systems, to the built environment than would otherwise happen. We can be smarter about where we place infrastructure and how we design our supply chains and how we operate our farms. And so activity that we're doing and people and communities will suffer less harm, I think would be the main impacts ultimately from these investments. As I mentioned, in order to get adopted, those investments have to deliver benefits today to the customers. And I'd also say that question brings up a topic, Dan, you and I had talked about last time, which was the Jevons effect. And so is there a Jevons effect for adaptation? I don't know.
The rebound effect, right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a rebound effect for most things that we do. Yeah. This one, though, is, as we said, there's mitigation, there's adaptation, and there's suffering. And by doing more of the adaptation, we're going to be doing less of the suffering. So even as things go downhill because of the lack of mitigation, we're just not taking climate action seriously. We're going to need more adaptation, even to make it comfortable for the people that are here, and I don't know. I think it's pretty cruel to say, oh, everyone should suffer now so that we collapse faster. That is, by the way, what some people think, but I don't think most people think that way.
I'm not trying to say that, by investing in climate adaptation solutions, we're going to solve every climate problem.
Not at all. You're going to adapt to them.
But there's lots that we can do that we're not doing today, and we can do it smarter and better using technologies that exist. That's the one little piece of this that I'm focused on.
So let me end with this question. You mentioned some of the things you're investing in now. What are some of the things you're looking at, or either looking at, maybe without mentioning companies, but areas you're looking at right now, and maybe those you think are going to be coming up in the next few years in this area of climate adaptation and resilience?
Yeah, the focus areas are the same. I think we've now invested in 7 growth stage technology companies, one in each of the focus areas, and there's much more to do. But those areas are agriculture and precision agriculture. There's a digital transition happening in agriculture. There's an autonomy and robotics transition happening in agriculture. But another thing that's happening is these effects of climate change. And so the investments we're making kind of combine those things. We're continuing to look in supply chains and logistics. We're looking at whether it's geospatial intelligence, satellites, drones, how to use data and digital mapping to better manage these affected industries. We're looking at insurance. We're looking at more things in health and water.
Water, yeah. And how do you look into making buildings fireproof? You're looking at that area because obviously all these homes that are losing their insurance in California, as an example, the solution to that, well, move.
Yeah.
Or make your house so it can't burn even if there is a fire.
There are a lot of homes that can't get insurance in California outside the FAIR plan, which is kind of maxed out today, that should be insurable at rates that could be afforded. And there are technologies to do that. The insurance industry is very tricky and hard to incorporate innovation. And so there are businesses that are trying to serve that market that we've been looking at.
Okay, very good. So, Sanjay, I want to thank you so much for being on Climate Chat, and it's a fascinating discussion. It's great to talk about sort of a somewhat adjacent area of investment that most people talk about in the climate space, and something that obviously and unfortunately is needed to a great extent. And so thank you for that. And also thank you for the work you're doing on Woodwell. And as we said, we're going to have to do a whole show on Woodwell because there's a lot of interesting research going on there on the climate science side of things.
Well, thanks for having me on, and look forward to talking to you again.
Right. And just to remind everyone, this coming Thursday, a special day and special time, 3 p.m. Pacific, Matthew England will be talking about accelerated warming and the ocean's role in maybe causing that in the last few years. Also, we'll talk about AMOC and SMOC and all of those kinds of things. He's an expert on that. The next Sunday, a week from today, Ben Santer, a well-known climate scientist, semi-retired at this point. He's done a lot of work on how we know that humans are the cause of climate change. And then on, again, special day, Thursday, July 31st at 10 a.m., their normal time, Stephen Chu, Sanjay's old boss and former U.S. Secretary of Energy, Nobel Prize winner, and current Stanford professor, doing amazing things there too, by the way. We'll hear a little bit about that. And so join us, hit subscribe, like, make comments in the comment section, and help spread the word. Refer this program to people that you think might be interested as well. So anyway, that's it. And thanks. And Sanjay, again, thanks again. And thanks, Leon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.